It's lovely to see you all. My name is Jennifer Wilkes, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to what promises to be another fascinating Warfield faculty book talk featuring my colleague Hershini Young in conversation with Chris Abani and Alexander Weheliye. I have the honor of directing the John L.Warfield Center for African and African American Studies, and as I've said before, celebrating the path-breaking work of our affiliates is one of the best parts of the position. Thank you for coming. Before continuing to the details of today's program, I want to acknowledge that those of us in North America are on the indigenous lands of Turtle Island, the ancestral name for what is now called North America. Moreover, I would like to acknowledge the Alabama Cushada, Caddo, Carrizo Comecrudo, Coahuiltecan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipan Apache, Tonkawa, and Isleta del Sur Pueblo, and all the American Indian and indigenous peoples and communities who have been or have become a part of these lands and territories in Texas. In solidarity with the Retelling Central Texas History Team, I also ask that we remember the struggles and legacies of Tejano, Black, Asian, Native American, and other peoples who have created this space within the context of ongoing dispossession and cultural violence. Now, for some additional words of acknowledgement. Warfield Senior Program Coordinator Christina Bryant is vital in managing our events from conception to execution. Please join me in thanking her for all that she has done to get us to today. Because collaboration and community are central to the Warfield ethos, I'd also like to thank the following colleagues for their support. Lisa Olstein, Director of the New Writers Project, and Elizabeth McCracken, New Writers Project Associate Director, Warfield Graduate Assistant Chelsea Okorafor for helping with publicity, Black Studies Financial Manager Alexis Chavez, and English Department Administrative Program Coordinator Janae Gutierrez for managing the funding for today's event. And then last but certainly not least, we ask that you consider supporting our authors by purchasing their books, one which you already see featured magnificently here, and others which you'll hear about shortly. Please consider using this handy NYU press code or supporting an independent bookstore such as Austin's own Black Pearl Books, located on Burnett Road in North Austin and always open at www.blackpearlbookstore.com. So as I noted at the top of these introductory remarks, our featured author is Hershini Young, who is Professor of African and African Diaspora Studies here at UT Austin. Hershini is an award-winning teacher and prolific author. Her previous works include Haunting Capital, Memory, Text, and the Black Diasporic Body, University Press of New England, 2005, and Illegible Will, Coercive Spectacles of Labor in South Africa and the Diaspora, Duke University Press, 2017. Today, the Warfield community is delighted to celebrate her most recent publication, Falling, Floating, Flickering, Disability and Differential Movement in African Diasporic Performance, NYU Press 2023. So it's not literally, but it's almost hot off the presses. I'd also like to commend Hershini on recently being awarded a fellowship at the Stanford Humanities Institute. Congratulations. Joining Hershini in conversation is Chris Abani, who is a novelist, poet, essayist, screenwriter, and playwright, who was born and educated in Nigeria and completed his undergraduate and graduate education in Nigeria, England, and the United States. He is the recipient of the PEN USA Freedom to Write Award, the Prince Claus Award, a Lannan Literary Fellowship, a California Book Award, a Hurston Wright Legacy Award, a PEN Beyond the Margins Award, the PEN Hemingway Book Prize, and, for good measure, a Guggenheim Award. His most recent works of fiction include The Secret History of Las Vegas, Penguin 2014, Song for Night, Akashic 2007, and The Virgin of Flames, Penguin 2007. Among his most recent poetry collections are Scientificum, Copper Canyon Press 2010, There Are No Names for Red, Red Hen Press 2010, and Feed Me the Sun, Collected Long Poems, People Tree Press 2010. Abani's work has been widely translated, and he also reaches diverse audiences through his TED Talks, public speaking, and essays. His many research interests include African poetics, world literature, 20th century Anglophone literature, and African presences in medieval and Renaissance culture, just to name a few, and he is currently Board of Trustees Professor of English at Northwestern University. In our departure from our usual format, we're also fortunate to have Alex Weheliye with us. Weheliye is Professor of Modern Culture and Media at Brown University, where he teaches Black culture, critical theory, gender and sexuality studies, social technologies, and popular culture. He's the author of Phonographies, Grooves in Sonic Afro-Modernity, Duke University Press 2005, which was awarded the Modern Language Association's William Sanders Scarborough Prize for Outstanding Scholarly Study of Black American Literature or Culture, Habeas Viscus, Racializing Assemblages, Biopolitics, and Black Feminist Theories of the Human, Duke 2014, and Feenan, R&B Music and the Materiality of Black Femme Voices and Technology, forthcoming from Duke later this year, so keep your eyes open for that. He is currently working on Black Life, Schwarzsein, which establishes Blackness as an ontology of ungendering. Needless to say, we are in for an engaging, provocative, and rich discussion. Please join me in welcoming Hershini Young, Chris Abani, and Alex Weheliye.
Wow, the room is so full. I can just feel it. And for a change, right? It's not packed to the rafters with only our grief. Look at us, like just sort of this wonderful vibrating Blackness. Right? The curl of shea butter and sweetgrass and black tea. Good. You need that. Look at us. With our elegant studies, our flights of blindness, and our monstrous and silent. And I give thanks. I give thanks for murderous wheelchairs, was it murderous 18-month-year-olds? For the old photograph where you lying rolling in the sand. For trusting me with the knowledge of your voices. For pulling me out of the oceans that made every time I fall in. Saidia, I know there's a whole sentence and half a lifetime somewhere in that word, so thank you. But before I get lost, right, amongst you all and amongst all this beauty, I want to actually just give thanks to the nuts and bolts of this tonight. Jennifer Wilkes, right, for working so much in the mind. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank Alex and also all the people from the NYU Press, in particular, Ellen Center and Fuquan Sayu. And a special thanks go to Chadwa Nyong'o, Kagura Macharia, and Alison Kafer, without whom this book would still be on my laptop. So, what I'm going to do,
use the mic.
Use the mic. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read for about 10 minutes from the book, and then we're going to kind of have a call and response between the three of us. We actually got together and tried to talk, and we just kept talking and talking and talking. So I think this is just a really exciting moment, right, for the three of us to be here. So. I don't know how to use commas correctly. I can't seem to unlearn an early lesson, right, when a teacher told me that commas represented those moments when you pause, when the sentence requires you to take a breath. Sometimes my breathing is appropriate as I inhale before the coordinating conjunction, but at other times, my commas are wildly errant as thoughts, sentences, histories, and time overlay each other, and I am gasping for breath. After all, as Jennifer Brody writes, punctuation as a nonverbal, gestural excess informs our quotidian movements and missteps by stopping, staying, and delaying the incessant flows of information to which we are subject. Breath as an arbiter of time.
Throughout this book, right, I argue that linear progressive time has little value in thinking about differential embodiment and movement. I argue that to disrupt progressive teleological narratives of an imagined time prior to injury folded neatly on top of a time after a cure, right, we need to think about different ways of thinking temporality. But whether we call it Black queer time or epiphenomenal time or crypt time, right, what I'm interested in is rethinking temporality that insists on our varied bodies as occupying a present moment saturated with a past and future that loops, stops, drools, lingers, and rushes. It is the time it sometimes takes my son to get out a particular word, and the time it takes me to listen quietly. Stuttering time. I watch strangers fidget, rush, trip over themselves to get to the end of his sentences. They are missing the avalanche of commas, the extraordinary ellipses, the dots that differential embodiment insists on. My son's stuttering results from neurophysiological differences. His stops and starts do not require another to fill in the words for him, nor do they require fixing in speech therapy so that he can keep up with the ebb and flow of normal conversation. Instead of seeing his stutter as an impediment to communication and speech, what happens if we envision his particular muscular tensions, rhythms, and patterns of words as an alternate world-making practice based in Black sociality and epiphenomenal time? Sean Cole's piece for This American Life, entitled Time Bandit, focuses on the composer and performance artist Jerome Ellis. Ellis tells Cole, "Stuttering is not bound to my body. It is a phenomenon that occurs between me and whoever I'm speaking to. I like to think of it as something that we share." Thus, instead of Ellis being the person who stutters, he recasts the interaction so that the weight and rhythm of language is shared. There is a stutter happening, he tells us. During his performances, Ellis tries not to resort to a strategy that most people who stutter have been taught to use, the substitution of one word that is difficult to say with another that's easier. He describes being deeply unhappy after a performance because he substituted the word disturbio with the word break when talking about the timing and fluency of speech. What he wanted his audience to do, he states, is wait. Sean Cole asks him, "Wait for the word?" Jerome Ellis replies, "Wait for it." But it was especially D's. They can be really painful. Waiting for a word in the silence stretches time. Ellis tells his audience to use the time of his glottal breaks to reflect or to remember or to honor the suffering of others. He gives us small spaces within language to breathe. Ellis's and my son's embodied aesthetic practice requires another form of listening that opens our possibilities for communication that not usually available to non-stutterers. Such speech insists on our disorientation, on us reworking how to relate to one another. Their words, stops, repetitions, and silences require us to step out of time with them, to slip the yoke, to painfully limp, and to balance delicately and joyously on jagged edges. Alternate world making is not easy or painless. At an event for the Michael and Tammy Lang Stuttering Institute, a little girl described her stuttering as the fluttering of hummingbird wings in her throat as words cascade nonstop out of her mouth. While the audience seemed to think this was a really pretty metaphor, I found it particularly terrifying, a throat scratched up by rapidly beating feathers. My son, on the other hand, feels like he is drowning. The words are ensnared somewhere deep inside him until, catching his breath, he releases them. Then there is the painfulness of the sound for Ellis as his body freezes, face tight, eyes wide. In the video performance Life of Life, Ellis collaborates with Alice Shepard to create a powerful sound, text, and dance collage. Shepard's dancing body is contained by the three walls of a cardboard box located in a field with tall grass and trees. Her movement is accompanied by Ellis's solo singing and later the lush melodic sounds of his saxophone. Life of Life is based around two newspaper advertisements for runaway slaves, one from Jamaica and one from Pennsylvania. Both these archival advertisements identify the runaway slave in question as having speech impediments. They call it a stoppage in his speech. Shepard's dancing is obscured at certain points by visual images of this archival material. Later, the performance shifts between Shepard in the box and the print ads for runaway slaves. In the spaces and movements between the two, questions arise about fugitivity and what Ellis, using Saidir Hartman's work, calls the opacity of black noise, those shrieks, the moans, the nonsense, the opacity, which are always in excess of legibility and off the law, and which hint at and embody aspirations that are wildly utopian, derelict to capitalism, and antithetical to the attendant discourse of man. The black noise at Ellis foregrounds, the stoppage in his speech, exceeds not only the runway advertisement as a gesture of the law, but also the confines of the sentence. I'm gonna play you just a little bit of this.
The law pretends to stutter.
These are the actual ads.
The law pretends to stutter. The stutter is coffee for the runaways. The stutter is reward. The stutter is passage. The stutter is a high chariot. The stutter is a scarred speech. The stutter is a house for speech. The stutter is a horse for speech. The stutter has run away from any government. Stoppage, thence passage, thence stoppage, thence passage.
So the stutter then is the time of black fugitivity, an uneven oscillation between arrested movement and the free fall of words, between uninhabitable enclosed spaces and the power of dance that creates black sociality. And I, like Shelley Jackson and Riddens, love this thick black music of black noise in which the tension between being unable to say and being unable to stop saying that is most characteristic of the stutterer's speech is elevated to an aesthetic principle. My son and I argue about reading, we paint quietly together, and we love each other in stuttering time.
Thank you. Thank you. Punctuations are a funny thing. When I was doing my PhD, I had this professor, Ron Gottesman, who always complained about my punctuation, and he would always write, "Mr. Abani, you have a salt and pepper approach to punctuations." But it's interesting because the idea that, and I'm thinking of poetry now also, because all of this is really about embodiment. And so what are bodies, how many kinds of bodies, right? But in poems, we talk about the kishura, right? So what other people might think of as a stoppage is actually just the space, and that space allows recursiveness and all kinds of things. So this is leading me to a question for you. I'm really blown away. But so my father's language is in Igbo, and in Igbo we say, "Okubi haja mamado." How we speak is how we know who is human, right? So the idea that your humanity is dependent on not the act of speech, but the act of utterance of word, right? So we say "Okwa bogozo," obo heguzuru ni titimado onwe yonyoso. Oku, which is to talk, to speak, is not noise. It is what stands between you, yourself, and another. So it's sort of really talking about the idea that every utterance is a collaboration between yourself, just within your own human body register, multiple selves, and then any kind of external self. And that kind of leads to time. So in West Africa, in Igbo we say akile, in Yoruba we say lai lai. So time is not thought of as linear or circular, it's thought of as an entanglement. So there's the idea of it being partly a quantum entanglement, and I'll open that up a little bit, and then there's the other idea of it being like a nest of snakes mating. So so to understand anything in a moment, you pull out one short thing from the others, you hold it and then you let go, and when it goes back, it continues the conversation even when the talking has stopped, right? So that's kind of how divination is done. But the other thing is simultaneity and convergence. So looking at just the presentation you did today about the comma, it really is this idea that everything converges into what we think of as a linear moment, but even as it's converging, it is simultaneously splitting out, which I think is the whole point of your whole aesthetic, right? You write a book that covers all these areas. So I'm just curious to ask you really about this notion of air, body, speech, time, and all the different embodiments you talk about, in any way you want to go.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I thought we'd start with an easy question.
Easy question.
And go harder and
Very
harder.
small,
as we go.
too. Very
Small
specific. Really specific.
Well, like just using, because you talked about your son and the idea of the stutter and the body. And so it's sort of the way in which stutterers are made to feel like they are the problem rather than the person listening, right? So again, talking about time, I remember as a kid after the Civil War, I went with my aunt to the market. Her husband had died in the war, so it was about 5 years. And she was trying to buy tomatoes, and she got really pissed off with the tomato seller and knocked over the tomatoes because she was broke and had no husband and stormed off. And I was a kid. And I remember this store owner would sort of throw in the typical African, "You are stupid, you are going." And then the man at the store next door said, her husband just died. And so she said, "When?" And he said, 5 years ago. And she went, just yesterday. Right? So that's why I'm talking about time, because there's a bigger way of thinking of it, but then just the compressed moments between utterance, between saxophone notes. Yeah.
I mean, I think part of what I was trying to get at in it is the way that time operates differently, right? In every chapter, it's like I have a different kind of theory of temporality, but really it's about this kind of what happens if you think about time as embodied and simultaneous, right? So I was thinking in the piece that I just read about waiting for the word, right? To think about in that pause, in the wait, in the stutter, right? When you keep saying the D, right? There's an entire world that emerges from that moment. And I think if we think about time as linear, it's like getting through the sentence, right? Like start here and getting through it. But actually what's happening is there are spaces opening up, right? In the sentence. And the reason that I want to talk about stuttering, and it's because it's a very embodied, so it's the sentence, it brings together the sentence, the text, and the body. Because stuttering is not just about the way you speak, it's your whole body. You get tense, like, my son's shoulders get tight, and I've seen people when they're trying to get a word out, right, their whole body is contorting. So we don't think about it, but all our speech is embodied. And I want to think about how different kinds of embodiment result in different kinds of speech, which create openings that we don't have in sort of normative kind of speech.
Maybe just to follow up on that a little bit, I was interested, in the book you have so many different beautiful moments of what you call differential embodiment, and really sort of, make us as readers rethink of what embodiment is, what it can be, what it can do, all these different things. So I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit about, because clearly this is all also a way of rethinking ability and disability. And I was just wondering if you could maybe speak to the fact of, working within and against disability studies with all of its limitations, right? How you find the idea of differential embodiment sort of gets you perhaps not out of some of those problems, but like gets you to a different place with them, if that makes if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I want to say that I'm deeply indebted to disability studies and so much of the work that was done there. But one of the things that I'm really interested in is thinking what happens to disability studies if we center kind of Black bodies and we center Black cultural production. And I think then there's something different happens. So the whole sort of binary between ability and disability, right, shifts. But I also, so there's lots of different kinds of differential embodiment, right? So there's somebody with one leg, there's somebody with no tongue, or there's somebody, who's spasming. But it's also much more than that. It's about thinking about all of our bodies and changing the way that we think about how we move and how we conceptualize bodies. And one of the major points in the book is that we think of ourselves as individuated, solitary bodies, and part of what my idea of differential embodiment is trying to get at is that we actually, I call it conjoined, right? So this kind of politics of conjoinment where bodies are not separate entities, they are different. We have all these different things that we tend to overlook, right? Or we tend not to foreground, or we see as something that we need to cure. And part of what I'm really trying to get at is not, obviously the politics of cure is a really vexed one. I'm not saying that, if we could cure something, we shouldn't, but there are lots of things that we should just allow to happen, like the stutter, right? After years of trying to cure a stutter, I realized, well, why am I trying to cure the stutter at all? Like, what is, because it's requiring me to listen differently. So it's about the interaction between bodies, right, that's happening. And that's where differential embodiment, I think, where it's trying to go that disability studies is not going. I also think that it departs from disability studies in that I also talk about the dead. And I think that that's very much part of Black studies and African American studies. I also, and this last thing, I think when you think about disability in Africa, right, there's a whole bunch of work that's being done, but it's all done by NGOs and medical establishments and vaccine, who gets what vaccine. So it's done in a very anthropological way, right? And what I wanted to do was move away from the kind of anthropological lens of looking at Africa and to think about it as a space of cultural production that's producing different kinds of bodies that are informing the rest of the diaspora.
And I think, your discussion of Kuduro is a really amazing example of how, there's this whole dance form, right, that is precisely built on the idea that differential embodiment is perhaps not something that it needs to be celebrated in the way that we're used to, but something that is acknowledged and is part of like the physics of the dance itself, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, so with Kuduro, right, it isn't about a celebration of, it's not a celebration of disability. What it is actually using a vocabulary, right, of, because so many people are injured, right, in Angola with landmines. And so the idea of what the normal body is has, it doesn't exist. And so with Kuduro, you see how bodies perform, right, in different ways that are not privileging able-bodied movements. So it's not privileging ballet where you can leap across the stage, but what happens if you drop to the floor? What happens if you crawl? What happens if you spasm? And those becoming not sort of compensation and not even survival, but actually these beautifully articulate ways of moving through the world.
And it's sort of interesting because So I've gotten to a point in my thinking and in my education in my life where I find a lot of the dominant Western thinking to be so unsophisticated as to be mind-boggling. And I think a lot of it is the wounding of the so-called Enlightenment. This sort of, the suppression that happens in Europe for years with the church, and suddenly one person is allowed to say the earth moves around the sun, and then suddenly the intellect is this big thing, whereas other parts of the world have explored, so I think of Western science as more sort of like the science of material technology, and I think of more Africanness as a kind of the scientific exploration of consciousness, of sentience, and different forms of embodiment. So for instance, even when we talk about the dead, in Igbo, that would be a specific way of saying it, because we always say, who claims you? And who claims you? So no one ever asks your name when they meet you. You walk up to them and say, Onyenwogu, who claims you? So we need to establish the lineage so we can sort of figure out where you fit in time. So when we say we're sort of talking about the reductive parts of the people who have passed on, who haven't integrated to be part of a lineage, right? So, but at no time are the dead in any way. But the lie of the Enlightenment is, you can see, and this is why Carnival and all these things exist, it's sort of that there is some idea between what is rational and irrational. And the more rational you pretend, the crazier you actually sound. The more irrational you sound. And so that this is a sort of a Western idea, so things can only be this or that, right? So if you look at certain performances, and even the idea of what we call masking traditions, although that is never a word you will find used in any African language. We talk about inspiritment. So, or when it's inert, we call it osisi, tree, wood, right? So there's no confusion about masking, but the understanding is that all of your ancestry is complicated, and that in your ancestry are other kinds of forms, snake forms, animal forms, different forms, and that is all located in the old brain, which is where the ancestral seat is. And so this is a profound knowledge of DNA for people who didn't know how to splice DNA, right? So what is being asked is what register, right, of your humanness is being enacted at any point. And the complete person is a person who has a full understanding of that lineage, right? So it's a question of intellect, wisdom, memory, and then what we call identity. And so within the cultures we come from, the reason why nobody asks your name first is that your identity is the most dangerous thing, because that's what wields the intellect, and then that's what starts chopping things into pieces that creates all the neuroses. And since we don't have a clear culture of memory and wisdom, there's nothing to aggregate. My grandfather used to say, the knife is the intellect is a knife and wisdom is a needle. So when you're talking about the projects you're engaging on, it's so fascinating, because even my presence here and Alex's presence here is a needle effect. We were both at Northwestern for years, never saw each other, right? And now here we are together here. So there's a way in which you talk about that collective, right? And it's not the Jungian idea of a collective unconscious. It's something connected to the word spoken to that young woman going up the mountain. It's connected to an idea that is at the fabric of Africanness, which is, so it's not hospitality like, oh, let me feed you. It's more connected to maybe Ubuntu. It's this concept that in all your frailty is my frailty, and I recognize all of these things together, and let's share this burden. So everything is that kind of where you're going with this?
A couple of ways to answer that, because so the different ways. So one is the word intabi that I begin with, And then the other way to answer it is the last chapter, which was a failed experiment in co-writing. So I wanted to think about those two things. So I start off with the word intabi, right? Because I think people fetishize different kinds of words in different languages, right? Like somehow there's a more authentic idea of blackness that can come out of this. And part of what I wanted to think about is, yes, it's useful to look at these terms, but these terms are openings out into like a larger discourse, right? Of how we think about ourselves, how we think about ourselves as, man with a capital M. And so that's kind of the first thing. And with Intabi, right, the story, it's actually something that my student did, and I wanted to actually also begin with a pedagogical moment because I feel like my students are so key to the way that, I think and grow. But with Intabi, this really young woman climbs up the mountain and she has asthma, right? And she gets to a certain point where she's like struggling to breathe, and people she's never met before sort of hug her and they say Intabi. In other words, they take on her asthma. They say, what you are suffering is what I am suffering, right? And so I start off with that because it's this idea of this kind of mutual vulnerability, and that if our bodies are conjoined, your vulnerability is mine, right? And so I wanted to center that in terms of like, why conjoinment? And then I also wanted to think about this kind of connection in a very practical way, like what does it mean to write together? So I started the last chapter with several people that I was gonna write with, right? Pavitra, Tiffany, Latawa King, and my sister Shamara Kwachi. And so one of the things that we were gonna do is this was an experiment in thought and thinking, like what does it mean to think together? And we tried it, and ultimately it failed. But instead of that failure being a failure, what it really made me think about is the kind of hard work that actually is required for us to take on each other's vulnerabilities, and the way that sometimes the spaces in the academy don't allow that, one, but also just spaces in our world don't allow that. To take on each other's vulnerability, right, is ultimately something that most people would never, ever do. And so I think that the reason that the last chapter begins as this kind of failed experiment in collective writing is because it's precisely to show that this is something we have to work on. It's not a kind of biological, like, you're black, I'm black, we're happy together. It's a kind of like, yeah, it's about working through difficulty, right? And part of what I love about this panel is, like I told you, it's like three Africans from totally different parts of Africa, but parts of the world, right? And different approaches. And so what kind of difficult work has to be done in translating and in assuming one another's vulnerabilities and connections, right?
I feel like I'm sort of asking the more academic scholar.
No, it's fine. It is what it is.
It is what I feel. No, what I really appreciate about your work, one of the many things I appreciate about your work, this book, but also I'm afraid of actually saying the title, I realize, because I know I'm going to get the order of.
Oh no, I get it wrong too.
So this book, this beautiful new book, but also Legible Will, and your first book is precisely that I don't feel there's this kind of disconnection between blackness in diaspora and blackness on the continent, and I feel like there's so little work that we have that actually does that in such a beautiful and in-depth way. And in some ways, you do thematize it, but you also take it for granted in a lot of ways, which makes the work even more special, right? Because it's not constantly sort of like going through the motions of, oh, I'm gonna show you this, and this is how, the diaspora and the African continent are connected. In some ways, you just take it for granted, right? In terms of how you write about labor and slavery, for instance, in Illegible Will, but also in terms of your, the archive that you have in this, in this book, for instance. So if you could maybe say a few words of how you approach that, how you think about it. I know you think about it. We've talked about it before, right? I think it's because I think it's important both from kind of like more from the perspective of Black studies, right? But also from the perspective of African studies, which is kind of this anthropological colonizer discipline, to put it like in very simple but not untrue terms.
We're trying to change that.
Yes. No. I mean, I know a lot of people are trying to change it, but historically speaking, whereas historically, a lot of Black studies has kind of ignored, particularly more recently, the continent, right? Focusing more squarely on diaspora and the kind of rift precipitated by the Middle Passage and everything that came that came afterward, and a lot of people are trying to change that. But however you want to take that.
So I think the two kind of things that I took for granted that maybe I shouldn't have, but I wanted to actually write a book just taking it for granted. The first thing that I wanted to take for granted is that Black studies is queer studies. I wasn't going to argue that, I wasn't going to prove it, it just is, and so I wrote it that way. And the second thing also is that, is the idea of Africa as part of the diaspora in these particular ways, right? So I wanted to think about slavery, but I also wanted to think about colonization. I wanted to think about, World Bank. I wanted to think about NGOs and the vaccines, but I wanted to think about all of these things together. And so I believe that diaspora studies and Black queer studies is a method. And so what I try to do is enact a methodology in this text in terms of like kind of the capaciousness of my examples, right? I moved from Wura Natasha Ogunji to Pope L, right, who's crawling through Times Square so there's this kind of oscillation between all these different things, and I mean it causes problems, right? So when they wanted to categorize this as the book is American Studies, and they're like, not quite, but is it African American Studies? Not quite. Is it African Studies? Not quite. And so even in terms of publishing, right, it got messy because nobody quite knew how to fit it. But this is kind of what I want to do. In a way, I'm just like throwing down the gauntlet. I'm like, I'm not going to argue this. I'm just doing it. Yeah. So.
That kind of third space that Chin Mahal was talking about way back and then. But it's interesting, though, because following up on the question, and even this idea of the sort of the scholarly and non-scholarly. So, because it's interesting, because embodied Africanness appears not to be scholarly, but it's entire. So, when we talk about legibility and what's available, like the archive, so the archive exists. It just doesn't exist in Northwestern's library in that kind of way, right? So because that's one, it's sort of what is a body, what is embodiment, who decides what it is, who legitimizes it, and then what is an archive and who decides it, right? So that's why I've been speaking a lot of different languages here, because the archive exists in the language. It exists in the languages that are spoken constantly. The powerful concepts are there. So there's so much of Western, for example, philosophy that is really just a bad explanation of bad Christianity, bad premises, and how many angels, and all these kinds of things. And you just think, well, what the hell is Kant talking about, And it's really not until you start to find bodies like Cixous and Derrida beginning to enter that main discourse that even the embodiment of a philosopher, right, enters. It's sort of spoken about as though there is. I'm being very sort of objective here, which is what anthropology pretends, as though there's no agenda, as though you can look at something and not shift it just by what you're looking at. So when you invoke performativities in the ways you do, it's sort of pointing to the fact that it's not that there are illegible archives, it's that people are illiterate in reading the archive. And that's why I continue to descend in the conversation away from sort of the evocation of certain kinds of old intellectual paradigms and sort of saying you can't make this separation between so for instance, you take something called Mbari. Mbari is an art that we practice in certain parts of Igbo land once every 7 years. a DBA through deep consultation goes into a trance and then selects random everyday villagers, not trained in any particular way. They go to the forest, the place is selected, it's cleared. They build a big fence around it, a big raffia fence so no one can see in, and they build a living archive of sort of mud adobe-based representations of spirits and heroes that they're all seen in their trance. Once it's complete, the fence is taken down. The rest of the collective come in, the fence is burned, and after the celebration, nobody ever returns there. And then the forest just takes it. So as a kid, when I was growing up, you're running through the forest and you just come across these events. And that's really what it is. It's an event in critical. It's like the planes. Every time you say 9/11, a plane goes into a tower. Every time you say in Barry, a whole collective has built something and walked away. So the conceptual models are already there. The question is where is the literacy in which these things are being read in juxtaposition? This is what I found so beautiful, both in the book before, The Illegible Will, and this one is sort of your insistence on a kind of, as you say, I'm going to gather interdisciplinary approaches. They're not perfect. They're supposed to fail because they're spectacular failures, right? Like every good novel is a spectacular failure. Midnight's Children, the Satanic Verses, right? Every successful novel is like, eh. So it's sort of opening up that space for the vibrant place, because often, I mean, at Northwestern, one of our big, is interdisciplinary, but every time you approach someone, everyone's scared because it's not their field, because it's sort of the not need to fail. And so the beautiful thing is that it's not failure in the sense that a thing doesn't work. It's failure in the sense that it's forcing the paradigms to expand. Just like at MIT, they run experiments so many times until it's failed so many times, and they can actually then design the experiment. So I feel that that's what your work does, is that it's opening this space that either tells us, look, let's just fail together until we can come up with a robust kind of way of talking about some of this stuff. So it's difficult because you're kind of on the cutting edge of something that hasn't quite formed. But what a beautiful, scary place to be. That was just to celebrate what you're doing. I have no question, really.
The scary edge of spectacular failure.
That's right. Of specularity. So spectacular. But yeah, so I think that's part of what you're doing by pointing to the absence of the archive. You're pointing to the failure of the current model of an archive. And sort of saying, well, if we have to talk about, if you think about Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon, right? Pilate is born without. Now, there are medical conditions where you can be born without a visible belly button, but this is the character, the woman whose whole link is to Africa, right? So, how it's asking certain questions about his history of being African in the sort of contemporary Americas. How do you regain a connection that has been severed in these ways? So artists are struggling with this in so many beautiful ways, musicians too. And I think that's one of the strengths of the book, is that you're sort of saying, look, this person's working on that, this person's working on that. They may not fall into what you might think of as the archive, but maybe we just need to open the doors a little bit, perhaps. Is that kind of your approach, or am I just being too excited for the work?
No, absolutely right. I mean, I was actually, so they asked me like what genres do I look at, and then I in one chapter, like I have stuff on Kuduro, which is a dance form, then I have stuff on a novel, then I have stuff on two paintings, then I have stuff on Hans Christian Andersen's like Little Mermaid, and then I have I have a section on the physics of the alligator roll. And it's deliberate, right? It's not just willy-nilly, and it's me trying to construct a different kind of language in which to think through sort of Black sociality, which is being formed in all these different ways. So we were talking about music, right? And so the whole she's lost control. Do you want to
talk about the great story?
You want to talk about that?
Yeah, I just, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but you talk about the Joy Division, the white British version, the original, right? I actually tend to think of the Grace Jones version as the original, even though I knew the one, but it's like one of those things, it's like when Aretha Franklin sings a song,
Right.
it's her song.
It's her
with
song.
Grace Jones, it's the same thing.
Right.
They don't exist before. But what I found really striking was in that version, and the way that you talk about the Ian Curtis version, is that he, even though he, embodied it in his own life, et cetera, and so on. Epilepsy, his record company kept it like under wraps for a really long time, and now it's kind of being retrospectively exploited in a lot of ways, which I also see that way. But when he sings that she's lost control, he's very much keeping the losing control at bay. It's really clear that this is not him, right? And in the Grace Jones version, and I think it's actually, it's not quite the same, but it's similar. Like the Spook Matumbo version that you talk about is also the video is not controlled, it's very unhinged. But the song itself, it has a very steady beat. His voice is kind of monotone. I remember when I first heard it, I'm just like, this actually sounds like Grace Jones. In the usual way that because she has that monotone voice too. But this is one of the only songs, and it's actually the only songs of her that I know. She goes from she's lost control to I've lost control. And she starts getting hoarse and screaming, and it's really clear, she's performing losing control. This is not something that's happening out there. This is both happening to the she that's being talked about, but it's also happening to Grace Jones, the performer, right? And I think then with the third version, what you then get is he uses, it's not quite as clear because he also uses he's lost control. So he says, she's lost control, I've lost control as a quote, and then he's lost control, and that disperses it a little bit more. And I think the music video disperses it even more, right? But I think it's a really interesting thing. And I also just think it's really interesting in terms of Grace Jones and who she is, her relationship to Blackness, diaspora, and gender, particularly, right? And the way that she performs that moment. So I think, yeah, it just sort of, it opens up the archive, I think, even more. So, yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about it. So, here we have, we have this kind of circumatlantic, right? We have the globe. And what's interesting, so I was listening to that, are the sound effects that are layered over like the dub beat, right? Yeah. And so the sound effects of like cars, like going out, it's a car crash, right? Yeah. And then it actually reminded me a little bit of a performance that Yuri McMillan talks about with Alicia Moran. It's called Breakdown with Simone Lee and I'm blanking. But where this woman is like, she literally is having a breakdown. So she's an opera singer. So Alicia Moran is an opera singer. It's this beautiful sort of, upright, very sort of classical trained voice. And she's like, I can't do this. I can't. Like, it's like, and she slowly dissolves and is like, I don't want to go to the ball game. She's like, I just don't want to. And it's kind of like this refusal that I see in the Grace Jones, where she's really pushing against losing control, which on the one hand, right, with all Grace Jones, you can go like, is she fulfilling a stereotype of primitivism, like out of control? But on the other hand, I think there's something about anger and control and being a presence, right, that comes through in that iteration. Yeah. So that is not in the Spook Matumbos. You're right. The music itself is very tight. Yeah. It's the video where it explodes.
The enjoyment.
Yes.
And everything gets exploded. Yeah.
So this is the difficult part of the faculty book talk because the conversations usually are so rich, but I imagine that you out there may have questions. So we want to open the floor up for discussion as another way of engaging our guests. So please let me raise your hand if you have a question, and I will come with the mic.
Thank you, and I've really enjoyed the conversation, and congratulations again, Hershini. My question is about how you get your work done, how all of you get your work done. And the perpetual, perennial question. I think that probably each of you has different ways of getting the work done, and it would be useful for all of us to hear how you're doing that.
Why don't you go first?
I just want to hold this up so you don't forget the title. And remember, there's 30% off.
What's up there?
There's just a Nigerian in me.
I got a lot of the book written sitting in the soccer field under the stadium lights where my child practiced. And I figured out where to sit on the field so I could get Wi-Fi. That's my answer.
I don't know if I have I don't know if I need this, because do I need this? No, okay. I've gone through different phases. I've gone through phases where I wake up at 4 a.m. because that's, when there's nothing else going on. In general, when I'm writing, it needs to be the main thing that I focus on. Like, I can't do the soccer field. I can read something or write an email in those kinds of situations, but I can't actually do writing them. Like, I have to have dedicated time, and that includes writing and everything, reading. I'm sorry, and everything that is related to the writing and so on. So yeah, I guess I have more of a stop-start. I can do editing, I can do copy editing, I can do all of those in between. But for the writing, the major part, I need the time. So it usually tends to happen in times when I'm not teaching and doing those things, which is not very frequent. The times when I'm not teaching. So yeah, that's what I would say. When you first asked that question, I was like, do I even get work done? Because it is so hard to do that with everything else that is going on. But I think also the other part of it is, that the teaching and all the other things, they also become a part of the writing process, right? Just in terms of the mechanics of the writing is something else. And for me, it's definitely the writing is part of the process of conversations such as this one, of teaching, of all of these different things that then sort of in one configuration end up on the page.
I think it's a bit of all of that, but because also part of what I do is I also teach creative writing classes and things. So I thought about this a lot, and I think, and also because when you go to do readings as a writer in bookstores and stuff, people always ask questions which I think are more ritual questions than they are. So one of the things I learned to figure out was the three parts of it: ritual, right, personality, and process. So ritual are the things you do to back into it, right? The right seat for the right Wi-Fi, but then you need to be at this game so you can assuage the guilt of I'm not neglecting my child, right? So you see how that ritual falls into personality, and I think all writing process is 50% personality. So if you're someone who's very really needs the straight lines in the world and to feel like you have a purpose, then you will write every day. But that doesn't mean you're writing, it just means you're putting words on. I have a friend who, he does 1,000 words every day, and it's been 10 years, so I calculate he has about 4 million words, but he can't find 40,000 out of the 4 million for a novel. Right, so he's not writing, he's sort of attending to his need to put things, to adjust the salt cellars and things. And if you're like me, and your most exercised muscle is your thumb from changing the channels, then you kind of realize that how most of it is interior. And so I'll always get an idea, sometimes a whole book title, and then I'll start making notes in notebooks everywhere I go, and I just think about it, and then it comes to a point where then I start reading about it, and then there's another point in which I just start writing sections. Just a paragraph here, like the way movies are made, you shoot a scene. And then later, when I have all longhand, because I don't know how to think onto a computer. It's nothing, it was just a weird behavior. And then I transcribe it. And so that's already, that becomes the first state of the edit. And then I have usually a few hundred pages of absolute incredible failure. And then you spend a few years going along it. So once you realize your process, where your personality and ritual fit in, the most difficult part about writing is the anxiety or the neurosis or the guilt that you feel like you should be writing. So to deal with that, I try to teach my students to separate themselves. So the first thing is they have to disavow the identity of A. So you're not a writer. I'm Chris who writes. I'm also Chris who fathers, Chris who uncles. I eat vegetables sometimes, other times only meat. Sometimes I'll chase a cow down and eat it while it's running across the planet. So in other words, you figure out that these things are appendages, and so because then once you do that, then all that 50% of the anxiety drops out. And then if you accept that you're never writing anything, that you're perpetually in process, because you always are, even as this book is finished, there's things that dropped out of here that are already, I'm sure, congealing into another book. You realize then that products will fall out when they need to. Along the way, you never need to worry about it. It's when you stop process, when you stop understanding what you're doing, what you're thinking, the things that are constantly expanding, I think that then we start to worry about all these different things. And I think that then that's also when the anxiety of field steps in. And because writing, like sexuality, it's just a continuum. It's wherever you're comfortable, you stop on that particular part of it. So the more free you get, the easier it is to move around and figure out how the things are done. But I think if you can acknowledge what is your personality in all of this, that will free you up to allow the process to happen. And then ritual becomes important because I can't imagine that writing, if you read the material, all of it is difficult. So you have to have ways to not be you when you're writing them. So, if it's Haagen-Dazs sucked through a red vine as a straw, if it's a bottle of wine, whatever you need to do to kind of break from who you are in the world so that you can be a thinker. And then when you go back from that to who you are in the world, and then those two worlds kind of can co-function. And then if you accept the personality part, the neurosis disappears, and then process becomes this endless, enjoyable thing because you're not looking for a product, but the product will emerge because that's part of process. That's kind of how I figured out. And I have boot camps to teach how this can be done. So if you ever want, you can enroll in my boot camp and we'll get going.
No, but I think the identity or personality a bit is really important, getting out of your own way, because so much of it is about, saying, should I really be doing this right now? Maybe I should be doing something else, et cetera, and so on. And, and letting go of all of those things and just saying, okay, I'm going to sit down and write and not necessarily expect that this is going to turn into X, Y, and Z, right?
And you're surprised that it turns into things you weren't even fully. It's amazing what happens when that happens.
Other questions? Are there any from the live stream? Okay, let me check. Oops. That is not the link.
We're also very well versed about shoes. The Kardashians. Have you? And have you seen So, we can talk about anything, really, while we're waiting for the... We'll take heckles. I think they're very important. They're very...
Thank you all. This was amazing. My notes are bananas. I wanted to ask some, highbrow, amazing, fantastic question. I'm not doing that. But one of the things that I really loved about this book were the moments in italic. I was like, there's Dr. Young, she's talking to us. And I was thinking about the way that you're kind of using these different genres. And I guess the unintellectual gossip girl question that I have is what didn't end up making it into the book, and what are the other kinds of things that are still scattered on the floor?
That is so intellectual, by the way. I'm sorry. I'm sorry to disappoint you. You failed at that.
Gossip Girl's also very...
It's very intellectual. Yes. So actually, I hated my first book, and the reason I hated my first book is that 30% of it was cut, and the 30% that the press cut was all different kinds of writing. But it was my first book, right? They were like, nope.
you can't do that. And so what was really nice about this is if I wanted to make the sloth talk and I have a section where the sloth is talking, I was allowed to do it. But to me also working in different registers, right? So I can't write a chapter about us being conjoined with animals in particular ways and not actually think about what it would mean for a disruption of the kind of text, disruption in the text, right, of something that wasn't human. Obviously obviously it's fictive, but it is a kind of gesture towards thinking about what kind of presences can erupt that are not human. And that's also why in the last chapter I tried to write it as scenes, like as scenes in plays, right? Because I also wanted to think about different kinds of writing that intersect with the academic. I mean, there's so much theory in this. It can get really. Sometimes I'm like, God, if I have to talk about Baradi one more time, I'm gonna, But at the same time, I also wanted to have different kinds of voices in there, even if the voice was a sloth.
Thank you for that excellent question. So first, we have a note of celebration, celebrating you, Hershini. Thank you for this work. And then a question. I really love the idea of throwing down the gauntlet and taking these intimacies / connections among Black studies, queer studies, African studies, etc. for granted. Is this something that you've always wanted to do as a scholar, or did you come into it? Do you feel like this is something that you could or would have done before this time, or is there something about the present that sets the stage for this work?
That's a fantastic question. One, I think I'm really grateful to the people that have produced scholarship before me, right? So in a certain sense, like so people like, Kaguru Macharia or, Ali Abdurrahman, like so this work has been done. But on the other hand, what I wanted to do is I didn't want to get bogged down in saying, this is queer, this is diasporic, this is this. Because I feel like sometimes we're defending the position so much that we lose the argument. And so what I wanted to do is take it for granted and do the methodology and then see. And I think there's two things. There is something very particular about this moment, right? One is that so much beautiful work has been done by other scholars, right? So that's part of it. But the other thing is the urgency right now. There's a sense, I feel like this real sense of urgency politically and in the world, right? Where we're sort of starting to retreat to like these really narrow understandings of things. And I wanted to say, no, this is not the world as I imagine it. This is the world as I imagine it, like based in a fundamental sort of queerness and queer Black sociality.
Okay, so I have a comment to share and another question. Sorry, I'm getting emotional. Proud of you, Mom. I'm watching this live stream while painting about my stutters in the studio. Yeah. Okay, so hello, everyone. I think that's the power of your work, Hershini, and the ways in which you have brought us all together and have made us think about ourselves as reciprocal, right, and conjoined beings. So I actually welcome the emotion. Hello, everyone. So happy for you, Hershini. Happy to be here and listen and feel enriched. You have this beautiful curatorial knack in your books to put literature, music, visual art, dance, performance, and conversation with one another via your brilliant theoretical lenses. I'm curious to know what you have been reading, watching, listening, feeling, staring at, rewatching, thinking about now. What has recently excited you?
Watching. I've just been watching the documentary on the missing plane. The plane.
The Malaysia one.
Yes, the Malaysian plane, which fascinates me, and then I also have a little group of us that we watch RuPaul's Drag Race. We watch RuPaul's Drag Race every week. But seriously, you guys are gonna laugh at me, and I'm kind of embarrassed to say this, but I've been fascinated lately by ships. So when my father passed away, my father was a historian, an archival historian. We left his papers alone for a long time, and now the papers are going to be archived. And my mother handed me a pillow sack of documents from my father. And, I started going through them and stopped very quickly. But part of what I found is I found a couple postcards that my father wrote when I was 1 year old and before I was born, and that he wrote to me, because he was actually, because he's a historian, he documented everything. So he took a ship. He took a ship from South Africa to the United States, and then took a banana boat and crossed all the way back, because he was too poor to fly all the way back to South Africa. So I was fascinated by ships. And so my next project is about salvage. And I actually have the first chapter of the book is coming out in Social Text this year. And it's about a ship that was sunk off the coast of South Africa, carrying like $30 million worth of silver. And so part of what I was interested in is how valuable the silver is and how unvaluable, if that's a word, the people were. And so it's a story basically of value, ships, and salvage. And the things that float out of the ocean changed forever.
And also global. Because that's what you do. That's brilliant. I love it.
Okay, so are there any more questions in the room? We have time. Okay, so my apologies to the live stream audience. I will share your questions with Hershini, and then I'm going to pass the mic to our two questions. I saw your hand first, and then I'll come back to you, Michael, to our two interlocutors in the room.
Hello, hi. It's probably more of a comment than a question, but I am associate professor of dance, and so I found myself really attracted to how you were using language, and I think often about our dance MFAs and how they struggle with language, and I was particularly interested in this idea of using verbs and how you use the verbs and how you think of choreography. And I think one of the things I was most drawn to, I was like, oh, I would love to get you in the room with our people on the dance side over there. But I also really appreciated this idea of bringing choreography into the writing and choreographing text, because I often feel like when we talk about embodied practices, the words don't feel embodied to me often. And so I'm looking forward to reading the full book, but from what I was able to read, the fact that it was asking me to tap into my senses, to feel what you were talking about, that it would generate images that asked me to consider the body in different kind of ways. And in my work, I'm really interested in all forms of movement and choreography. So to me, I'm like, crawling is as amazing as a pirouette, as a twerk. Like they're all like in the same category. And to hear you talking about it in that way, and then illuminating the ways that it is interrupting some structures that exist was really appealing to me. So thank you.
I was so worried about bringing choreography in because, all of my besties are choreographers, and I was like, they're gonna be like, what are you doing? But it was essential, right? Because if I'm talking about movement and bodies, we have to theorize choreography. So I have a lot of ways of thinking about choreography and movement that's trying to push against, right, traditional dance studies and actually to incorporate different kinds of movement.
Hey, Professor Young. Long-time listener, first-time caller. I just want to say first a comment. Every time I read your work, I have a question, and then you just expect me in the text. I'm just expected there, whether it be a footnote or you coming back to it a few pages later, and I'm just like, you think stuff way too much. You think through this stuff way too much. You be researching too much now, and I appreciate that though, because I need that. But I had this whole thing that I wrote up, but I don't care about it right now. I wanna ask you, because you had this whole structured presentation, but there's this idea that you present in the last chapter of your book in relation to unhinging, and it's neurocacophony. And I love the concept, and you've discussed it with me. You tapped on it once, but I'd love for you to talk about it in this space and tell people about it, because I think it's one of your most beautiful neologisms that you offer to us.
This is actually like a conversation that I had with Allison also. But I was looking at Audre Lorde, and she was talking about symphony, like voices coming together, right? And I think so much of the time that we think about Black sociality, again, it's like us all working together and creating something harmonious. And one of the things that I wanted to think about is because Audre Lorde actually warns against, she says, we want a symphony, not a cacophony, because if we have a cacophony, it's deafening, it's unhinging, it's like it's us falling apart. And what I thought is so valuable is that moment of us unhinging and falling apart, right? So I'm really interested in different ways of thinking, right? So especially because I am neurodivergent, right? One of the things I've always had to think about is trying to translate certain things in the world, like how do other people think about this? How do I think about this, right? And rather than imagining one way of thinking about things, what I wanted to do is think about all these different ways that our thought processes come together to create not a symphony, not a solution, but a cacophony. And the value is in that cacophony, right? In that unhinging, in that unbearable noise that happens when we come together. So again, it's about a sociality that's not easy. It doesn't sound good. It doesn't make you feel good necessarily. It does at times, but it's also like it's a noise riot. To use Hartman's term, and it also, I think, is key because so much of disability studies, right, has looked at the body, and this whole thing is about the body. But I didn't want to maintain a kind of separation between body-mind, right? And I know that scholars like Sami Scholk, for example, use the idea of body-mind. I didn't want to do that. I wanted the body to be the way we think, because I think that we think through our bodies, right? We move through our bodies. The way we understand the world around us is embodied. And so that section on the neurocacophony is not to add mental disability to a discussion of disability, but actually to say that it's even our thinking is embodied.
I think that goes along very well with what Chris was saying earlier, the image of the snakes that you pull one out of, and it sort of makes sense or sheds light on something, but then you put it back and it's still the cacophony, right? If you
Yeah, but also this is so fascinating because when I was teaching at UC Riverside, I used to notice that for visa, green card reasons, kids would join the army, right? And we'd all be in class, and then they would go off to Iraq, and they wouldn't come back. Some wouldn't come back, and we would continue as though they had never been there. So I started having these sort of brown bag conversations where I was trying to bring vets in. And so first place I wanted to start with was people's relationship to the body, right? So before going to, because death can be so easily abstracted. And so people would come in who had different sort of prosthetics on, and we'll talk about it. And I noticed that everybody over 30 would always ask them about what they had lost. And everybody under 30 asked them what enhancements they had. If they had a different prosthetic for running, and so I started to to realize that there seemed to be a moment when embodiment has shifted, because I grew up in a generation where just one small part of the body was so important. So that's, your body's in the wrong place, you're a black man over here, and all. But there was a bigger idea of the body, which seems so central to Africanness, because the mind is a body. And so even in the human body, there's sentience at different places. Your second brain is this is just within traditional thoughts and traditional philosophies. So I wanted to ask, why is it called disability studies and not just embodiment studies? Because it's sort of that Western frame, right, that starts from a pathology and the loss rather than the embrace, right, and a holisticness. So not necessarily to conjoin it, right? Not to heal, as you said, and not to erase the trauma either, right? But to figure out, anyway.
Again, right, this is the problem with publishing. So they were trying to figure out where I would fit. And initially they were like, well, we're not going to put you in crip studies or disability studies. This should be somewhere else. And then they were like, well, you'd reach an audience that wouldn't look at it otherwise. This is just practical. Right. But also, again, I want to say I am indebted to the kind of work that people have been producing out of disability studies. And I want to, really acknowledge that as well, even as this is it's borrowing from that and Black studies and putting it together in a way that I think should happen.
Well, we can continue the conversation over food, and there is also cake outside to celebrate Hershini's publication. So please join me in thanking Hershini, Chris, and Alex. This really was amazing. To our audience, if you enjoyed this afternoon's event, you might also be interested in 2 upcoming programs. First, this evening at 7 p.m., right back here, Chris will be giving a reading, sponsored or hosted by the New Writers Project, and we hope that you'll come if you're able. And on Tuesday, April the 4th, the Warfield Center is hosting Angela Davis for the annual Eric Williams Memorial Lecture. In-person tickets are sold out. But thanks to the genius of Lates, we will be live streaming the event, and you can find that link on our website. And for more information about all Warfield Center and Black Studies activities, please look for us on the web, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thank you for coming, whether you're here in person or online, and please take care.